Timmy, run!
Yes!
In this video, we will dive into the movie 28 years later. We will discuss the storyline, summarize the plot, explore the cast and characters. Additionally, we will cover the movie's production details and box office performance. Finally, we will provide reviews and share personal reaction. So, let's get started. The films open in the Scottish Highlands. A boy named Jimmy is watching televiewers with his sisters until their mother arrives in panic. She tries to lock the kids in the room for their safety, but people infected by the rage virus break through and start attacking. Jimmy escapes, but his sisters are not so lucky. He runs out of the house to a nearby church where his father, a priest, is preparing for the infected to come for him. Jimmy's father gives him a crucifix necklace to carry before the boy hides. The heart of infected burst through, infecting the priest as he wanted. Text states that he rage virus old west to the UK. It was driven back from continental Europe, and the British mainland was coordinated to contain the virus. Any survivors would have to fend for themselves. 28 years later, a community of survivors had formed a village in Lindisfarne. A man named Jamie is preparing his son's bike to go outside the gate of the community to kill his first infected with his bow and arrows as part of a coming of age ritual. Spike's mother Isla is ill and spent her days in bed. The other villagers chase Spike on his heads out with the Jamie. They get into the forest where they first come across several absent infected. The two manage to kill them with their arrows, with Jamie's first kill hitting for one of them in the neck. They proceed forward and end up in the house where an infected is tied upside down. It continues to struggle, and Spike has trouble finding the right opportunity to kill it until it breaks itself free and gets an arrow in the heart. Jamie and Spike move closer up to the mainland. Spike sees a fire nearby, but Jamie tells him not to pay any mind to that area. They come across a pack of infected, which are led by the stronger and smarter Alpha. The infected chases the two, but after managing to kill most of them, they hide out in a house until it gets dark. When the time is right, Jamie and Spike start running back to the village. Even the high tide makes the path back harder to get through. The Alpha chases them, but Jamie manages to alert the gatekeeper, and they send a large flaming arrow into the Alpha's chest before letting Jamie and Spike in. The others celebrate their return. A party is thrown in Spike's honor. He asks one of the elders, Sam, about the area in the mainland with the fire. Sam tells Spike about Dr. Lan Carlson, a supposed madman who let out hundreds of bodies in a line when Sam had once gone to that area with another survivor. During the festivities, Spike witnessed Jamie going out for another woman and engaging in an affair, shattering his trust in his father. The next morning, Spike asks Jamie if he knows about Dr. Carlson. Jamie appears quiet and does not answer, even as Spike asks if he did not want to help Isla get better. They get into an argument, leading to Jamie slapping Spike. He quickly regrets the decision, but Spike holds a knife at his father and orders him to stay away from Isla. Spike later takes Isla and leaves Lindisfarne to go to the mainland and find Carlson. Isla goes in and out of lucidity, as he often calls Spike dad. Meanwhile, a troop of NATO soldiers arrives on the mainland. They are chased by infected, with some of them falling victim to rage as well. Three soldiers survive and go to a tunnel, where they are confronted by a new Alpha, and Trio's once had a witty spine still attached. As Spike and Isla keep moving, they are chased by another hordes of infected. They hide a gas station that is filled with the flame. Just as infected break in, a soldier named Eric shoots the gas and ignite it, blowing all the infected to hell. Although Eric is exasperated that Spike cannot help him get back to his man, Spike and Isla join Eric as they keep moving on. They sit together and bond for a while as Eric tells Spike about the world outside the UK. The trio await the infected, but Isla hears one infected woman screeching inside a bus. Isla sees she is pregnant. She tries to calm the woman down, and the woman appears to lock hands with Isla. After giving birth, the woman goes berserk until Eric shoots her dead. Spike and Isla see that the baby girl is not infected with rage, but Eric still plans to shoot her. Before he can make a move, the Alpha pulls Eric out into his own head and spine out. Spike and Isla run out and are chased by the Alpha unit. It gets by Dr. Coulson. He has named Alpha Samson and has developed his own toxin to keep Samson disloyal. Coulson shows Spike and Isla has bone trample, which he has created as a shrine or memento mori for the deceased. Coulson has peeled all of their skull into a tower. He takes Eric's head and burns the flesh off, adding the skull to tower. He determines that the baby was protected by her mother, placenta, which separated her from infection. Coulson does an examination on Isla and determines that she has terminal cancer. Spike is devastated, but Isla accepts her fate and comforts him. Coulson puts Spike to sleep before Isla joins him so that he can mercy kill her. When Spike wakes up, Coulson presents him with his mother's skull. Spike climbs to the top of the skull tower to place Isla's skull there. The following day, Spike and Coulson must evade Samson again. They lump into a part where Samson tries to strangle Coulson, but Spike knocks him out again with one of Coulson's morphine dart. Afterwards, Spike and Coulson part ways. Spike brings the baby home. He has named Isla back to Lindisfarne, along with a note for Jamie and the other villager to take care of the baby since she is clean. Jamie runs out into the river to try and find Spike, but it's high tide and Spike is nowhere to be seen. 28 days later, Spike is eating a fish he caught until he is found by infected. He kills one but is chased by more until he hits a dead end. Spike is then found by a mysterious blonde man, Jack Connor, and he is cut off similar looking flower. He offers Spike help, which he quickly accepts. Danny Boyle and Alex Garland have done it again. In the early 2000s, 28 Days later became the most popular and influential zombie movies in decades. With its fast-moving, virally infected, not quite undead, revenging through a post-apocalyptic England. Now Boyle and Garland have reunited with the 28 years later, easily the most talked about horror movies since Signer, and the biggest zombie movie seen in the PG-13 Delusion Award was back in 2013. Compared with the countless familiar zombie movies and TV shows that have propped up since the original movie, 28 years later is a thoroughly challenging, unpredictable work, which means there is a plenty to discuss now that spent a well-attended weekend in wide release. Here are some major spoiler-heavy topics related to the film's style, themes, sociological implications, and, of course, that ending. The original 28 Days Later is notable for its zombie efficiency rather than the slow shuffling and gradual, varying levels of undead decay often seen in zombie classic from George R. Romero and in many movies influenced by his film Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and so on. These zombies are not technically zombies at all. They are victims of a lab-leaked rage virus with the hilariously dogged additions of showing monkeys violent news footage that seems to be separated by visually any exposure to an uninfected person's blood or saliva. Within a minute or two, the newly infected will be vomiting blood and attacking anyone around them in a deranged frenzy. The victims are analogous to zombies because of their seeming thirst for human carnage, though it is never clear whether they are truly feeding on humans, and the mindlessness with which they pursue it. But here are less supernatural variations than some of their ancestors. The same was true for the 2007 sequel, 28 weeks later. That's still the case in 28 years later, but with the passage of time built into the story. While and Garland introduces a new variants on the post-viral populace, there are still mobs of rage virus victims, often in rage or no clotting at all, roaming the countryside, which remains confined to the United Kingdom. But 12 years old Spike and his dad Jamie also encountered infected who have been swollen by this virus and now lush belly drawn around in the dirt, often subsisting and worms, reproducing and not just because of his endowments. Later in the film, Spike and his ill mother, Isla, encounters a woman who is both infected and pregnant and is even distracted enough by the imminent arrival of her baby to allow Isla to lend a helping hand in the birth. Perhaps more surprisingly, the baby is born healthy, seemingly not infected with this virus. The idea of an asymptomatic carrier, as seen in 28 years weeks later, goes unmentioned but is fair bet that if the baby were infected, the human who carry her around for the next year plus would probably get sick at some point too. The movie's resident philosophical Dr. Riskal's Lan Carlson chalks this up to the miracle of the human's placenta, which seems oversimplified, but these zombie variants raise a lot of interesting questions. Are the alpha zombies evolving closer to what we think as a humanity, regaining some of their intelligence while maintaining a capacity for brutal violence? He seen multiple times pulling off head in the tandem with spine, like something out of a Predator movie. It's visually implied that the alpha is the father to this newborn, suggesting that the zombies procreated post-infections, which is something these movies or any movies say surely there must be one with zombie sex, but it's not a typical feature of the genre. Have not shown before. Zombie reproductive rates must still be low. Dr. Cousins points out that a human baby can't really survive for more than a few days without milk, and if infected women can still breastfeed at all, it's hard to imagine how that would work on a practical level, especially in terms of not spreading the virus. Maybe this baby, saved by Islam and Spike, is the first zombie born human to survive. Thematically, the baby's arrival fits with the complication of the seemingly functional, isolated community where Jamie and Isla have raised Spike, the baby who Spike ultimately delivers back to the community before striking out on his own, implies that the world that they have understandable cut themselves off from nonetheless keep turning and may even produce new human without the as easiest and most comforting sense of renewal. Quite of the opposite, the zombie variations give that outside world its own strange new shape, rather than showing the virus simply burning itself out in quarantine. Viewer will probably supply on whether that crawler or alphas are too cheesy, too reminiscent of the other zombies picture, too far afield from this relatively grounded viral origins of the first film, but in a movie that some audiences will probably also find short and traditional thrills. These elements keep the landscape strange and unpredictable. As a director, Boyle has long been known by a certain degree of flash. 28 years later, evolves his style even further. The original films made innovative use of early digital video, which has held up remarkably well even as the tech itself has degraded. Few movies have reproduces the grimy, low-rem imagery that sometimes smear into a kind of poetic abstraction. For the sequel, Boyle and returning cinematographer Anthony Dodd Mantle have not reproduced this look. Either instead, they are updated it using inventive multi-iPhone rigs to capture similarly bracing images. Boyle and Mantle use this technology to shoot from Boyle's trademark extreme angles and unexpected vintage. Add micro freeze frame to scene a practically tense action and deftly utilize real location, adding up to one of the most distinctive looking movie of the year and a major triumph for Mantle. For all of its wild swing, his work never feels overloaded or sensationalized instead. The visual guide the audiences through a series of expeditions, bending shift, including passages where the movies feels more skin to dark fairy tale with the alpha blooming and shadow on the horizon than a traditional horror picture. As with 28 days later, it's easy to see how other filmmakers might imitate some of these techniques on a superficial level. It's also hard to picture other bringing them together with such digital cinematography is now the norm. Boyle belongs with the Michael Mann, Steven Soderbergh, and David Fincher as some of the few mainstream directors who are able to embrace its differences from celluloid rather than trying to hide them. Somewhat more time has passed in the world for the movie than in our world. Technically, they are 5 years further into the future than we are. In terms of release date, the movies have taken us from an immediately post 9 by 11 world to one that still bear the scar and bear the echoes of the COVID pandemic, a rise of the countless post 9/11 armed conflict, including one unfolding in the Middle East. Right now, Wells has specifically mentioned Brexit as a touch point in the development of 28 years later, which indeed sees Britain isolated by force rather than by choice and festering. Thought movies does not underline any COVID parallel too broadly. It could be read as a post-pandemic allegory, with Spike's desire to rejoin the world, regardless of how it's been altered from what his parents know, conflicting with the strangeness of the community he was born into, essentially a quarantine within a quarantine. Dr. Carlson, in the meantime, is determined to memorize the dead with his towering bone temple of skull, rather than using his resources to move on, fortify his defense, which also sets our sympathies apart from outright COVID or the anti-vaccines crowd. It might be surprising of a sequel to a movie that came out in the shadow of 9/11 to traffic in messaging that could amount to never forget. But Bryce and Garland turned the mantra around to graphic with how we as the collective human race are expected to proceed as survivors of so many Sonder for me disaster. How many of those disasters came to pass in the rest of the world, which we are told has been cleared of the rage virus, is another one of the movie's interesting open questions. On paper, 28 years later, ends on an infuriating sequel days that leaves the movie largely unresolved. The reality is a bit more complicated than that. The film actually reaches a highly satisfying, if thoughtfully elegiac and open-ended conclusions after the Dr. Carson make an approximate diagnosis of terminal cancer for Isla. She asks him to be authorized and her son places her newly polished skull at the top of the Carson's monument. Eventually, Spike returned to his island community alone but only long enough to drop off the infant and a note for his father. He then heads back cut into the unknown alone. This boat continues the coming of age thread at the beginning of the film, when Spike makes his first trip to the infected, heavy mainland with his father and rejects it, where Spike not just dabbling in Zombieland for some real-life target practice, but deciding to actually explore the country at land. He has prioritized as a less regimented pre-saccharide life over the ritual and safety that he is known, having accepted at least to some degree the role of death in this life itself through the loss of his mother. Then a bunch of Jays called Jimmy show up. The final scene of 28 years later actually picks up from its opening, set during the original rage outbreak, where a young lad named Jimmy escaped the zombies as his weaker fathers welcomed him, seeing the hordes as a harbinger of end time. Aaron Taylor Johnson's Tammy is close enough to a home phone of Jimmy to maybe mistake him as a grown-up version of that survivor, but no, an adult version of the real and no tracksuit Jimmy Jacks Connor, who also played an interplot in Pops Up to save Spike from another group of zombies. He is commanding a mini army of imitators and seeming acolytes who gleefully and clinically dispatch the infected as if they are just run in from a guy movie. Then the movie ends not exactly on but leaving the audiences hanging on what's next for Spike and the Jimmys. This also involves a cultural touch shows most American audiences will miss, making the whole thing seem even more impeccable. Jimmy and his gang are dressed like Jimmy Savile, a once ubiquitous British TV presenter accused for widespread sexual abuse, including of children. Jimmy Savile died in 2011, and the allegations against him became well known afterward, which means this Jimmy would not be aware of his name's crime. In the world of 28 years later, there is good chance they never came to light at all. But for 2025 year, at least those aware of Savile, the surface goofiness of these sequences give way to the discomfort, and more thought about what gets preserved in fallen world is this apparent religious cult formed around the image of a top of the popes hosts a grim joke in the accidental whitewashing of history. While Guy Ritchie has directed 28 years later The Bone Temple, and neither has Bile Nia DaCosta, who made the 2021 Candyman reboot as well as The Marvels and Littlewood. Directed the already filmed Garland Band sequel, which is supposedly out in the January thought sometimes ultra short gap sequels wind up pushed around the schedule, fearful of going out too soon. A subtitle refers to something that's already been unveiled. Dr. Carson's momentum, which the movie seems to have left behind as Spike make his this way in the world. The second film could well circle back to the follow Dr. Carson and leave Jimmy for whatever Garland and Val have planned for the third movie, with more that would certainly fit the new movies. Repeated narrative survivors of refocusing the who that where when of survival. But Boyle and Garland have said that the Jimmy sequences that set up the second movie, and that Murphy will appear in the similar capacity to set up the third. So it's fair to assume Spike will remain the lead characters for that installment. This would make him and whoever joins him the first 28 days later series character to really carry over as days, weeks, and years are followed different groups for people. Maybe the Bones Temple is more of symbolic reference than a literal one, referring to how Spike carries awareness of the dead with him on journey, which seems like a pointed contrast to the uniform of the Jimmys. One thing is clever. Clearboy and Garland have set up a sequel, not by obviously holding over many characters and stories back for anything movie, but by overflowing these posts applicable with ideas. 28 years later, the latest is the Danny Boyle and Alex Garland zombie franchise. Has plenty of horrifying moments. People are decapitated, guts are spilled, blood flows freely. But the final sequences introduces the most disturbing element of all, if you know the context. 12 years old Spike Alfie Williams has decided to leave his secluded island home to explore the UK's zombie-infested mainland. He seems to be managing pretty well until he encounters a horde of infected who start to overpower. Then a mysterious man comes to the rescue. He is wearing a tracksuit and a blonde wig, and he calls himself Jimmy. He is played by Jack O'Connell, who is having quite a year playing creepy guys between his and Sanner. Jimmy offers to help Spike out, then ends a small army of followers, dressed exactly like him, to take out the zombies as do almost hilariously acrobatic flips. But there is nothing funny about the persons their get-up references. Jimmy and his crew are dressed like Jimmy Savile, the once adored British television presenter who was accused for committing hundreds of instances of sexual abuse, many of which involved children. The eternity of Savile's crime is extensive and deeply upsetting. Now took advantage of the access he had to medical facility because of Caribbe's work to prey on patients. He also had what our doctor called him. While Savile's crime were despicable, Americans may not grasp the hold me on British culture prior to his death. If you are not British, it's difficult to describe what Jimmy Savile was. Gill wrote in Vanity Fair in 2013. In the 1960s, Savile was best known for hosting the music show on Top of the Pops that was followed by the BBC program which would grant children's wishes. A train formed in 1972 in the 1990. For what's what, the decision to evoke Savile has already caused outrage in the UK. after on-set photos of the Jimmys were published by The Sun. One person told the paper, when we realized the horde of the zombies were dressed as Jimmy Savile as we were shocked. It's at best eyebrow raising and at worst Thomas journey. The characters are not technically themselves zombies, but the point still stands. The choice is a provocative one, to say the least, but it's also interesting to consider what it may mean in the world of 28 years later. If we are to believe that the raged virus broke out in 2002, when 28 days later was released, then the pandemic happened before the British Republic would have had widespread knowledge of Savard's crime, as Gill wrote that, and have been visible. In fact, we meet him in the movie's Code Open. He is the blood boy watching the telebubis when the mask starts. His father, Calibius, offers no scantry instead after giving young Jimmy a cross. He allows the infected to attack him, seeing the disaster as more kind of holy experience, a new judgment here. When the older Jimmy approaches Spike at the end of the film, he wears the cross proudly. He also has apparently turned himself into the something of a religious leader, which devours who obey his command. But why do they dress like Seville? The young Jimmy in 2002 would have known Seville as a strange but treasured entertainer even when Seville lay dead at the age of 84 in 2011. His reputation was indeed such good, standing that people from all over the country traveled to attend his funeral in Leeds. We don't know much about Sir Jimmy Crystal. We will learn more in 28 years later. The Bone Temple out in January. But we do know that his early days were shaped by a collision of trauma, raging zombies, and pop culture. And yet there is clearly something nefarious about 28 years later Jimmy that evokes that we understand about Savile now, especially given how the fictional Jimmy invited young Spike into his community. Arguably, this is all in the poor taste, but Boyce's and Garland's choice also feel interconnected with the movie at large. A film wrapped up in the iconography of Britannia, good and bad. On several occasions, Boyle cuts in footage from Laurence Olivier's Henry Wieland uses a Kipling poem almost as score. In Spike's hometown, there is still an image of the Queen in the place of honor. Did she get zombified at any point? Hard to say. In the black half of 28 years later, the movie's team emerged in full with when we meet Ralph Fiennes as Dr. Kelson, a man who rejected the isolation that Spike's family chose and instead decided to embark on a year-long project of memorizing the dead with an extravagant Bone Temple in the English countryside. Garland's screenplay explore what parts of our humanity we lost in an apologetic Sir Jimmy Crystal has chosen to idolize a monster in distressing, but at the same time, it feels intensely relevant to the project of 28 years at large. The Demise of Hampton Dream. 28 years later is a superb, motivative horror movies with a lot of different things on its mind. And our 2 hour it movies through quite a few tonal shifts. Folk horror, coming of age family drama, gory action movie, and surreal meditations on societal breakdown. Even this context, landing is draining and might have viewers wondering what was it all about. On one level, a setup for the film sequel. Screenwriter Alex Garland wrote an intro of script for the return of the Zombies franchise and the second of these 28 years later. The Bone Temple has already been shot and will be released in January 2026. 28 years later's final scene clearly sets up characters who will play a big part in the next movie. But viewers outside the UK may not realize that the scene has an additional shocking layer to it because it makes explicit references to perhaps the single most revealed figure in British contemporary culture, the media personality and prolific sexual abuser Jimmy Savile. To say the least, it holds choice and it leaves the filmmakers with a very fine line to tread to the Bone Temple. Let's dig in. The rest of this article contains full spoiler for the ending of 28 years later. 28 years later final act is dominated by an elegiac passage. in which the young hero Spike Alfie Williams says goodbye to his mother Isla, who has accepted a peaceful death at the hands of Dr. Carlson rather than suffer through her cancer. Spike then chooses to go walk about on the infested mainland rather than the return to his island community. After dropping the baby, he and Isla found back at the island. 28 days later, Spike is attacked by a group of infected. Escaping them, he is rescued by the colorful group of crazed warriors who attack the infected in a flamboyant style. Their leader is Jimmy, who was the Scottish boy seen in the movie's prologue set at the start of the outbreak. He wears the crucifix his previous father gave him upside down. After the movie and the meditative and after film's proper, this final scene is a total change of mood. Colonel's liner are played for broad laugh. The soundtrack mixes the Teletubbies theme with loud punk music, and the style employed by directors Danny Boyle is frantic and irrelevant. But the imagery is also extremely sinister because the gang's gathering, tracksuit, gold jewelry, and long black wigs are clearly modeled on Jimmy's Savile. If they are without, the credit seal, it O'Connell's character is referred to as Sir Jimmy Crystal. Anyone outside the UK is likely wondering if you know grew up in Britain in the late 20th century. As I did, Sir James Swell was an inescapable, kind of clownish but also beloved pop culture figure. He came to be famous as a radio DJ in the 1960s and was a TV fixture through the 1780s and 90s. As a presenter of the Top of the Pops chart show and the Jim's Fix It, a sentimental early evening variety show in which are made wishes for kids some true. His persona was that of a benevolent, wide uncle. His mandate catchphrases, heavy deliver, and signature look, often embellished with the tinted glasses and cute cigar, were much mocked and imitated, and made him incredibly famous. He was known for tireless charity work, practically fundraising for hospital, which led to his kingdomhood in 1990. After his death in 2011, claims for rape and sexual abuse by Sewell, which had been a distant rumor during his life, started to solidify over the following year. The truly horrifying scale of his crime became clear through criminal investigations and public inquiries. His victims numbered in the hundreds over five decades and included many children and vulnerable people. Many of his crimes were perpetrated at the hospital he visited under the guise of his charitable work. He appears to have been protected and his action covered by poses at the BBC, in the National Health Services, and by other establishment figures. So in the UK, Savile indelible public image has become synonymous with his predatory evil as well as with the hypocrisy and of the establishment. The first film is Boyle and the Garland's Zoomy series 28 years later, shows Britain being completely ravaged by the rage virus in 2002. It follows that in this world, Savile's crimes were never exposed, and he would live on his mind of survivors like Jimmy as a national treasure. The famous funny videos, who was nice to little kids on TV, or would he Jimmy, a young boy in 2002, may not even have been born when Jimmy's fix it went off the air in 1994. After that, though he was still famous, status in British culture started to wane. He is not quite as potent a figure of UK millions as his folks Gen Xers like Danny Boyle, Alex Garland and me because they don't have any positive associations with him from childhood, so it's questionable why Sewell would loom so large in Jimmy's imagination that he would style his cult after him. Teletubbies makes much more sense. The iconic show originally ran from 1997 to 2001. There is clear dramatic irony to the use of Jimmy Savile imagery in 28 years later. UK viewers know about his crime, while the characters don't for us. He is a symbol of evil for O'Connell's character and his acolytes. He is a prosperous half-remembered image of a bygone Britain. Asked about his shows of Seval imagery, Boyle told Business Insider he has as much to do with pop culture as he is to do with his software, to do with the cricket, to do with the honor system. It's all kind of twisting in his partial rememberness, clinging into the things and then recreating them as an image of for flower. In a same interview, Garland called Sir Jimmy Crystal a sort of trippy, fucked up kaleidoscope, and he also referred to the distinctive power of nostalgia. The thing about looking back in how selective memory is, Garland said, it cherry picks and is amnesia, and crucially, it also misremembers who are living in the time right now, which is absolutely dominated by a misremembered past. It seems like Garland and Bias are using Saval to make the point that the nationalist nostalgia behind movement like Brexit a clear inspiration for 28 years later. Vision of an isolated Britain cling to a romantic past that was, in reality, much darker. Wall has said it Bone Trample is about the nature of the evil, and that Sir Jimmy Crystal is that the embodiment of this evil. The role of Jake O'Connell's character and his family, which is a replacement really, for the family he loses at the beginning of the film, is to reintroduce evil into what he became a compassionate environment. He told The Independent it seems he has taught the Bone Temple Mischief the series emphasize away from the infected and onto more human antagonists. While it may not be controversial to associate Seval with evil, it's of questionable taste to use an image of a man with hundreds of living victims just to make a point or to get a reaction. The filmmaker certainly seems to be an provocateur more in the ending of 28 years later. O'Connell is unafraid to be deliciously entertaining in his civil style get-up, while amps up his shooting and editing style into something that's almost a parody of his punk rock transporting high. This kind of provocation is one thing is a super good, and another is that it's basic for an entire movie. It's also one thing coming from Boyle, who is himself an icon of the cool Britannia 1990 and is deeply fluent in his country iconography so much so that he directed the closing ceremony of 2012 London Olympics. But Boyle is not directing the Bone Temple. That was falls to an American, Naya da Costa, who can't have the same level of familiarity with the subject matter. It's all leaves da Costa with some fascinating but very tricky British cultural territory to navigate in the Bone Temple. She will have Garland's script as a map, and presumably the guidance for both Garland and the Boyle as producer. But in the UK, where Sevilla's image has gone from evil president to all but forbidden over the past 15 years, it can't help but be intensively controversial. The reviews are not, and the consensus is clear. 28 years later is a great during movie. It's also exceptionally wide. Work for me, I don't know about you, but I would rather it's a throw film that takes big, risky swings at a cookie cutter blockbuster that plays it safe. And if you allow yourself to settle into its curious rhythm, Danny Boyle and Alex Garland's zombie sequel is enormously rewarding. That is not to say that it's not chock full of odd stylistic choices, provocative plot points, and a swift splash tonal shift. It certainly leaves you with lots of questions, chiefly among them. If life in Britain came to an abrupt halt in some point in 2002, was Pierce Bronson's at least spared the ignominy of another day. Even if you were a zombie the size of an industrial fridge freezer, would it actually be possible to rip someone's head off? And where the hell did Ralph Fiennes get all the Edoni? And yet, none of this leaves us crushing our chin so much as 28 years British bizarre, provocative, dumb, bold, hilarious, and just plain silly applique, which mostly serve as a teaser for the sequel to come in January, The Bone Temple. 28 years after the death of Spike's Alfie, Williams' mom, Isla Jodie, he has continued his solo journey further into the mainland, during which he has developed into a savvy survivalist while cooking fish over a fire at his roadside camp. He is confronted by the handful of infected, the first of which he easily dispatches the new brow arrow, but when arrive that he can handle on his own, he opts to run. Alas, he soon finds that he road, nestled in the middle of a ravine, is blocked by a pile of bloaters. With a horde of infected bearing John or Spike, all seems lost until someone else emerges from the lip of the ravine above. Finally, Jerry, he is and it's Jack, only he is almost entirely unrecognizable in blonde wig, bright crack suit, and enough jewelry to stand out magnific. He introduces himself as Jimmy, and it's quickly apparent that this is the adult version of the kid we see in the journally Teletubbies prologue. Among his stack of gold chains is his father's curvy fix. He is clearly bonkers. Well, hi, that's what seeing your entire extended family started by rage infected zombies will do to a guy. Jimmy is soon joined by other Jimmy, all of whom wear variations of the same garish grab. They proceed to kick the infected asses with a litany of crude spear and nunchuck in a breakneck, bloody won't-touch evocative of Tontino at his most grand house. They invite Spike to join them on the road, and there we have it. The Bone Temple out in January. Fog, get your ticket now. Such an ending has proven divisive for a new reason. For one, it threatened to overshadow the poignant, cathartic conclusion to Spike and Isla's journey at the Bone Temple. You are still wiping away the tear when the O'Connell gang broke up and started cutting off head. There also the fact that the Jimmy cult or dressed like disgraced British TV personality Jimmy Savile. Luke Savile is never explicit, referenced in 28 years later, but he does not need to be. The multicolored tracksuit, blonde wigs, jewelry, and the very fact that they are called Jimmy make it clear enough. Either this is a staggering, nigh, or negligent coincidence or the Mad Max Elan. Madness of the post-apocalyptic world has spawned a group of cutists who style themselves after Britain's most infamous sexual predator. It's noteworthy that, in the world of 28 years later, the collapse of Britain proceeds several crimes coming to light. So presumably in this universe is still most famous as the old ball host of Jimmy Fix-It. In a film of a big, bold swing, 28 years ends with a high mark and yet too naughtily provocative, and ending does not feel overly out of step with the rest of the movie. And what we have learned about the infected Britain early on, Spike's dad Jamie cautious his son that people have largely gone made on the mainland evidence of which is provided in the Dr. Carlson, who might turn into the right son of man, but is single-handedly built on intraday monument out of human skeleton. On a slightly deeper level, Garland and Boyle are clearly interested in exploring the new traditions, cultures, and values that have emerged on the past apocalypse. The community on Holy Island is glued together by a culture descended from old school English nationalism, hardly surprising given their enforced Brexit. While Carlson has found purpose in his preoccupations with memento mori, even the infected have formed social group, have sex and try to bet. It's such a leap that a group of innocent survivors would begin to mold themselves after a famous TV star, then best known for his eccentric, singular look. Make no mistake, it's daring to go from Isla's emotional dad to Jack's O'Connell and company doing kung fu in Jimmy Savile cosplay. The first time I watched 28 years later, I found that such a closer tonal shift took away from the former scene's deep, meditative pregnancy. This did not bother me so much the second time around. But still, it would have been nice to have been able to sit with the feeling with a longer, without being washed away by a B-movie bloodbath. Nonetheless, it's an affected taste, and you would best believe it will be seated for the best temple. 28 years later is credited with the popularizing the fast zombie to cinema, unlike many iconic zombie films, concludes with a plot twist hinting that humans are the real monsters. 28 years later takes a different approach. It's a late sequel and a stand-alone coming-of-age story that illustrates how life moves on. Even after the apocalypse's wild setting in intro-going sequel, The Bone Temple. The film began with a bungled attempt by Jamie Aaron Taylor to induct his 12-year-old son Spike into manhood by taking him on a scavenging hunt to the mainland where he can see the remnant of British society and make his first kill. Spike feels deeply disappointed by his father when Jamie later lies about his prowess and cheats on his chronically ill mother. After 23 years, 28 days later, producer and actor Danny Boyle, writer Alex, and cinematographer Anthony Dort Mantel have reunited to make another chapter in the post-apocalyptic franchise. 28 years later, now in theater via Sony Pictures, releasing reunited the trio for a third chapter in the series after John Garlow's 2007 sequel 28 weeks later. In this new feature, Jodie Comer, Aaron Taylor Johnson, and Alfie Williams play a small family who crosses from their casual island community over to the zombie-filled mainland to gather supplies and handy undead. Things start going south from there. Various zombie survivalists played by actors like Ralph Fiennes and Jack O'Connell also roam around this dangerous zone and can provide as much anxiety for the family as any of the undead. Variety spoke with Boyle and Garland about writing another chapter after all these years. Shooting the film on iPhones and how to studio horror landscape has changed since 28 years later. AG, Danny, and I had discussed it many times over the year. The original films had not vanished in the our films can do. And it's hung around in the immigration, so we talk about it. And then some things after COVID, I had a crack at a script. But the script did not work. It was too generic, I think, but in a way. Having taken the wrong step, freed us up to think in a looser, more expensive way. Then another story arrived that was a lot bigger in scope. And at that point, we felt okay, this is what we will work on. AG actually it did not really touch on COVID at all. What it did was follow a trope of these kinds of things, which had to do with weaponizing the virus. It's an easy space that one can fall into these kinds of stories. It's not saying that are all bad. I mean, in some ways that's what Aliens is weaponizing the alien, and it's a fantastic movie. But certainly in the executions I read, there was something crazy about it. I think in terms of the relationship between the films and COVID, what I would say in there are two ways you can make or approach films. One is to make film about other films. You make films that you loved when you were younger and you reconfigure that explore them and do your version of the film that you loved. The other is that you are reacting to the world around you. I think Danny and I both separately and together fit into that second category. So COVID was something that had happened. So in that respect, it would not have been possible to work on these films without being informed of it in some way. But that does not mean it was the reasons or the instigator or the core theme. It was not. It had a value of the property because the first film was a success certainly for the budget it was made for and continued to have an impact over the year. But he still signed up a very ambitious trilogy and financed the first two films. The Nia Da Costa short second film will come out January 16. I think one of the wonderful things about horror is that you are expected to maximize the impact of your story. Everybody wants to do the same drama, or with the romance, whatever. But with horror, it's obviously gonna be brutal, some of it. What we loved was setting it against an innocence that is presented by the various children in it, and also the landscape. The beauty of the landscape of the nature. Having those two forces stretches your story as far you can go. We maximize them. That was our principle, and the studio was supportive of that. Of course, they were. Alex, I wanted to dive in a little bit about the inspiration behind Jack O'Connor's Jimmy Crystal. At the end of the film, we are reintroduced to him as an adult cult leader, which is doing so did you get that idea of his character from. But he is from the same thing that the entire film is from in a way, which is his films and in a way the whole trilogy, if we ever get to make it as a trilogy, is in part about how we look in a regressive way to the past. Very simple. Danny and grew up in an era where everything was about looking forward in some respect. And currently, for the last 10 or 15 years, we are in an era that is very much about looking back. What a film is copied with on some level is a way when we look back. There is an amnesia and there is cherry picking. Also, there are things that are misremembered what the film is. If you look at the individual character, but you also look at the community that's represented and the elements about the communication and the world building is a mesh of these things, things that have been forgotten, things that have been cherry picked, and things very misremembered that are smashed together, which carries within a kind of some commentary. Yeah, and what's annoying is we can't show it on YouTube because of its content. Is the perfect illustrations of how we want the cameras to work. There is a scene where the Alpha drops into the train. You can see his and what he done to poor Eric from Sweden at the end of the shot. All in one, that was challenging to set up, and we were hoping to exploit it a bit more in the promotion of the film. But you can't apparently, so you have to go to cinema to see it. It's worth it. I don't normally recommend it exactly in that way, but a shot is worth it. He's an executive producer on this and was enormously sportive. He appears briefly in Naya film. I don't think that's giving too much away. And our plan is that he will be an enormous character in the third film, in the way that Jack O'Connell, characters who you see briefly at the end of the first film, is an enormous character with Ralph Fiennes in the next film. The script is not written, it's there is a trend, there is a story, there is a plan, there is a structure. These three films are in some ways distinct from each other, in other ways interrelated, because there are characters that have a true incline throughout of all them. Although they are essentially separate stories, it makes it, in filmmaking terms, have something in common with television. Both Danny and I have worked at some point on television, and TV has a slightly more organic element about everything can unfold. So people might have a written whole story arc, but they will get discovered in the shooting how that story arc really lands. I think that having written the first one in many ways, I did not know at that point what a film would be, because it's a whole set of the discoveries left to uncover. The same is also true with the second film. So I had to understand sometime about what Ralph Fiennes is going to create with Danny. To be able to believe into that, there is always a gap between the thing that exists on the page, as it's a gone through the filter of many people's imagination and agendas, and then again in this edit. So short answer, I have got the idea, I have got the plan, but there is not a script. I am waiting to see what happens, I suppose. Somebody pointed out to me that women know from an important part of the horror audience. I remember vividly somebody telling me, somebody an authority, somebody who seemed to know what we're talking about. When we made the first film, they said, no woman will see this film. I remember we were trying to big up Naomi Harris' character in the first film, and I think it was probably a conversation about that. They were dismissive of women watching horror movies. That's changed, and I think that's a very good thing, obviously. It's also perhaps a contribution to why horror has sustained as a genre, and why horror is important for us to maintain a communal cinema experience. Because it's one of those things that people clearly still want to see in a cinema of the can. Their preference is to see it cinema, and we should celebrate it. Because of those communal experiences, as we live life more and more through the technology power that we have in our pockets, we are kind of encouraged to use that as a first means of communication. The only means of communication in the most extreme with our fellow citizens to sit together in a dark room and to go through the scare, the fear, the joy of watching a horror movie. When they are good, they are joyful. I think it's an extraordinary release and not to be undervalued. There is one key bit of information you need to know before you watch 28 years later. It's not a complete story. Okay, sure. The film does have its own narrative arc, but it's meant to be the first of a whole new trilogy of films. The second title 28 years later, The Bone Temple, is already shot and tuned out next year. But if you did not know that, you might watch the ending of 28 years later and be utterly perplexed. I am almost positive some members of my press screening audiences were obvious to this information as I heard many of them grumbling and voicing confusion after film's big climatic moment. This is pretty frustrating overall because I said in my review 28 years later is pretty damn good. In fact, everything up until the ending worked and works exceptionally well. And then director Danny Boyle and writer Alex take on the usually vaguely final moment mean to set up the next movie. The tone of the scene does not match the rest of the movie at all, and it feels like we have accidentally started watching a completely different film. In short, it does not work, and it's bound to confuse some people. To be fair, the 28 years later ending is not completely out of the left field. The scenes for the final and what comes next are planted in the movie's very disturbing prologue. This moment jumps back to the beginning of the outbreak of the Rage virus we saw in the first film. We see a group of kids somewhere in the Scottish watching on TV in a house. Suddenly, shows Arabs as infected people burst in. The parents of the kids are quickly dispatched, as are the kids themselves. But one of them, a lad named Jimmy, escapes. He runs to a nearby church where he encounters his father, a priest, rather than be afraid of the infected. This man of God sees the event on a holy, divine moment. He gives young Jimmy a cross and he allows a horde of infected ghosts to attack him. Jimmy watches in horror as his father turns into a monster. It's scary stuff. And then the film jumps forward 28 years later. After this intro 28 years later, zeroes in one completely different characters. Our main focus is Spike, Alfie, a 12 years old who lives on a secluded island with his father, Jamie Tyler Johnson, and his mother. Great Britain has effectively been counted from the rest of the world, trapping the hordes of infected people and those who are not infected inside, and Spike and his family live in peace, scalded from the mountain and its infected ghouls. Throughout the film, we get a reminder about Jimmy via same graved scrawled on a wall and his name carved into the chest of an infected person. Confusingly enough, Morpheus' character in the first film, 28 days later, is also named Jim, but these are clearly not meant to be the same person. The implication is that Jimmy is out there somewhere. Isla is suffering from a mysterious illness, and Spike decided to take her on a dangerous journey about the infected mainland to find a doctor to help cure her. Along the way, Spike and Isla rescue a baby birthday by an infected woman. The baby appears uninfected. Eventually, they find a doctor who sadly tells them that Isla has cancer, and she dies peacefully. After Isla's death, Spike drops the baby off back at his island community, but opts to head out into the mainland on his own and explore. Boyle and Garland should have ended the film here. Instead, there is a truly vaguely scene where Spike is rescued from a horde of infected by a gang of goofballs wearing bright-colored tracksuit. The colors of the clouds reflected the colors of the Teletubbies. This group does a bunch of backflips and parkour movies and kills the group of infected. And then the leader of the gang, played by Sander, Vampire, introduces himself to Spike. His name is Jimmy. You know, like the kid at the beginning of the movie, roll credits. Kennels is clearly having fun in this beef scene, but his character feels so strange, and he's a strange actor. which seems to be a direct reference to a notorious English TV personality Jimmy Savile strike out like a store bomb. Will this make sense in the next movie? Probably, but here it feels completely out of place at a heart and otherwise strong film. It's another example of modern movies not understanding that they can tell one complete story without setting up a whole franchise. I am interested to see where the story goes from here. It seems clear that even Jimmy and his gang had Spike. He's probably bad news, but 28 years later, did not need to end like this. American writer Halvan Coben has had a prolific partnership with Netflix for several years, with a number of his work adapted into the movies and television. A major highlight of this partnership is Fool Me Once, adapting Cobble's 2016 novel of the same name into a British thriller series. As protagonist, Maya Keegan recovers from the apparent murder of her husband. She learns that he is evidently still alive. As this mystery is explored, the dark history behind Joy and Maya's family come to light by the shocking series finale. Fool Me Once is one of those shows that works best when you don't spend too much thinking about the implications of its baffling plot twist, and those twists come fast and furious by the last handful of episodes, including Joy's alleged return and Maya's role in all of this. As outlandish as this story gets, viewers will stay hooked just to see how the show sticks its landing. It isn't a parasitic soap opera in the best kinds of ways. Fool Me Once is Netflix's best adaptation of Cobain's literary work to date. Period piece romance gets an enormous boost in popularity with Bridgerton, the first Netflix original series produced by Eugene Quinn of television Shonda Rhimes. A Brigger series is 2023, the accent of Queen's Carlut, India, are made for in the 1816, including her marriage to King George III, is explored in the book of the story. This is the interperson with a flash forward to an older queen, urging her children to produce a role here in 1817. While Queen Charlotte works best for viewers that have seen at least the first two seasons of the Bridgerton. First, the series is beautifully self-contained story set in that world. The show's limited series from lets it tell a more focused story than its main series counterpart, really expanding upon on Amor's history. India does a particularly good job in portraying the younger, keeping the characterization recognizable while making the role hold on. For even the most casual fans of Bridgerton, Queen Charlotte is definitely required viewing. While filmmakers Mike Flanagan often uses the horror genre to tell compelling personal stories between the scare, none are as intensive conventional as Midnight Mass. The limited series is set in a small town on a coastal island that welcomed the arrival of a mysterious young priest, Father Paul Hill. Father Hill's appearance coincides with the return of recovering alcoholic Raleigh Flynn, who is hoping to rebuild his flat in his hometown. This presages a strange occurrence around the island, growing increasingly disturbing and paranormal as the truth behind Father Hill is unveiled. A true labor of love of Flanagan, Midnight Mass elevates the scare with being commentary, organization, religion, addiction issues, and small town drama. There is a mystery at the heart of Midnight Mass, and when what was come to Crockett Island openly bores at Fanges. It does so with the bloodthirsty fury. Flanagan would make numerous acclaimed horror shows after Midnight Mass, but never again as frankly personal and soul exposing wearing its Stephen King influences on its sleeve. Midnight Mass was Flanagan's last Manfred masterpieces at Netflix's. Scottish comedian and writer Richard Gere drew heavily from his own life experience to create the British Netflix series Baby Ranger. Gere plays Johnny Dunn, an aspiring comedian who works at a London pub to make ends. Martha Scott Jessica. This leads Martha to obviously stalk Johnny, affecting his personal relationship as Martha's behavior. becoming increasingly disturbing. Meanwhile, Johnny has to reconcile with his own trauma that becomes clear as the show reaches its ending, which is endured from his mentor, television screenwriter Darren O'Connor, Tom Goodman here. After 23 years, 20 years later, producers and director Danny, writer Alex, and his cinematographer Anthony Dodd have reunited to make another chapter in their post-apocalyptic franchise 28 years later. Now introduced via Sony Pictures releasing reunited the trio for a third chapter in the series after John Carlos Personal's 2007 sequel 28 weeks later. In this new feature, Jodie Comer, Johnson and Ashley Williams play a small family who crosses from their secluded island community over to the zombie-filled mainland to gather supplies and hunt the undead. Things start going south from here. Various zombie survivors played by actors like Ralph Fiennes and Jack O'Connell also roam around those danger zones and can provide as such anxiety for the family as any of the undead. Whitey spoke with the Boyle and the Garland about writing another chapter after all these years, shooting the films on iPhones, and how the studio's horror landscape has changed since 28 years later. Danny and I have discussed its Danny's times over the year. The original film hadn't vanished in the way films can do. It stuck around on the film's hand landscape and it stuck around in our imagination. So we talk about it. And then sometimes after COVID, I had a crack at a script. But the script did not work. It was too generic. I think, but in a way, having taken the wrong step fades up to the thing in a loser, more expensive way. Then another story arrived that was a lot bigger in scope. And at the point we felt, okay, this is what we will work on. Actually, it did not really touch on COVID at all. What I did was follow a trope of these kinds of things, which had to do with weaponizing the virus. It's an easy space that one can fall into these kinds of stories. It's not saying that's all bad. I mean, in some ways that's all. What aliens is weaponizing the alien. But it's a fantastic movie. But certainly in these executions I did, there was something lazy about it. I think in terms of the relationship between these films and COVID, what I would say is there are two ways you can make or approach from. One is to make films about other films. You make films about your love when you were younger and you reconfigure them and you explore them and your version of the film that you loved. The other is that you have reaching the world around you in a way more than other films. I think Danny and I both separately and together fit into the second category. So COVID was something that had happened. So in that respect, it would not have been possible to work on the films without being informed of it in the same way. But that does not mean it was the reasons or the insecure or the core term. It was not. There was a bit of backward and forward. But I think we have to play far tribute to Tom Rothman and Sony because he took this one. It had a value, the property, because the first film was a success. Certainly for the budget it was made for and continued to have an impact over the years. But he still signed up for every ambitious trilogy and financed the first two films. The Naya the Costa short second film will came into the January 16. I think one of the wonderful things about horror is that you are expected to maximize the impact of your story. Everybody wants to do with drama, with a romance, whatever, but with horror. It's obviously gonna be brutal, some of it. What we loved was setting it against an innocence was represented by the various children in it. And also the landscape, the beauty of the landscape, the nature, having those who forces catches your story as far as you can go. If you maximize them, that was our principle, and the studio was surprised of that. Of course, that were. But he from is the same thing that the entire film is from in a way, which is his film and in a way the whole trilogy. If we ever get to make it was as a trilogy, it is part about how we look in a progressive way to the past. Very simply, Danny and I grew up in an era where everything was about looking forward in some respect, and currently, For the last 10 or 15 years, we are in the era that is very much about looking back. What this film is with and some love level is a way when we look back. There is amnesia and there is cherry picking. Also, there are things that are misremembered what the film is. If you look at the individual characters, but you also look at the community that's represented and the dilemmas about the communication and the world building is a mash of those things. Things that have been forgotten, things that have been cherry picked, and things have been misremembered that have smashed together, which carries within the kind of commentary. Yeah, and what's annoying is the weekend. I know it's YouTube because of this content is a perfect illustration of how we want the cameras to work. There is a scene where the Alpha drops into the train. You can see the genders and then what he done to poor Eric from Sweden at the end of this shot all in one. That was challenging to set up, and we were hoping to exploit it a bit more in a promotion of the film. But you can't apparently, so you have to go to cinema to see it. It's worth it. I don't normally recommend it directly in the way, but that shot is devoted. He's an executive producer on this and was enormously supportive. He appears briefly in this film. I don't think that's a giving too much away, and plan is that it will be an enormous character in the third film, in the way that Jack O'Connor, characters who see briefly at the end of the film, is enormous character with Ralph Fiennes in the next film. The script is not written, it's a trench. There is a story, there is a plan, there is a set structure. These two films are in some ways distinct from each other, in other ways interrelated because there are characters that have a true line throughout all of them. Also, there are also essentially separate stories. It make it. If filmmaking terms have something in common with television, both Danny and Howard worked at some point on television, and TV has a slightly more organic element about the way things can unfold. So people might write a whole story arc, but then they will discover in the shooting how the story arc really lands. I think that having written the first one, in many ways I did not know at that point that the films would be, because there is a whole set of the discoveries left to uncover. The same is also true with this second film, so I had to understand something about what Ralph Fiennes is going to create with the Danny. To be able to lean to that, there is always a gap between the thing that exists on the page. So is it gone through the filter of many people, imaginations and illusions and preconceptions, and then again in that did it. So short answer, I have got the idea. I got the plan, but there's no script. I am waiting to see what happens, I suppose. Somebody pointed out to me what have women know from an important part of the horror audience. I remember vividly somebody telling me, somebody in authority, somebody who seemed to know what they were talking about. When we made the film best film, they said, no woman will see the film. I remember we were trying to big up Naomi Harris' character in the first film, and I think it was probably a conversation about that. They were dismissive of women watching horror movies. That's it, and I think it's a very good thing, obviously. It's also perhaps a contribution to why horror has sustained as a genre, and why horror is important for us to maintain the communal cinematic experience, because it's one of those things that people clearly still want to see in the cinema often again. The difference is to see it in cinema, and we should celebrate that. Because of those communal experience, as we live life more and more through the technology power that we have in our pocket, we are kind of encouraged to use that as the first fact means of communication, the only means of the communication in the most extreme, with our fellow citizens to sit together in a dark room and go through the scare and fear. The joy of watching a horror movie. When they are good, they are joyful. I think it's an extraordinary release and not to be undervalued. I recently watched 28 Years Later for the first time in a year. The movie's innovations handled digital camera, MTV era cutting and brutal. Fast zombies like it just still pack a well and 22 years at the same time other films. TV shows and comics have grabbed so much from Danny Boyle and the Alex Garland that he concept feels exceptionally role. That's why the idea of the pair returning to the story Where 28 years later interrogate me so. The world has changed, later have changed, and who create careers have changed 28 years later. Does a great job of studying into the those changes and delivers us caring, exciting adventures that has more to say about 2025 than you might think. 28 years later is not why what most people will expect technically, the very definitions of a legacy sequel, especially given that it's the first of the planned trilogy. The movie explores a world where that is prevalent and horror is around every corner, but that people still need to get on with life. It's a very British movie in ways beyond characters and setting, and they keep calm and shall carry on at those premiers. The idea of a new normal is now not new to the apocalypse media. However, what is this movie does not set up apart is that the line between post-apocalypse and not apocalyptic is too small. We learn in the movie that mainland Europe was able to stop and eradicate the Regio virus, but the UK could not NATO place it under global guarantee. Art abandoned these people. Everything about our modern world exists outside of the UK. On the island is back to the Organian hunter-gatherer societies, or as we say, also see endless outlets of infected. The focal point of 28 years later story is a family living in a very small community on an island off the coast of England. The only way on or five is island is walkable causeway on low tide. As the story begins, Father Jamie Taylor prepared to take his 20 years old son Spike to the mainland for the first time for the all important rite of the passage, the first hunt making matters more difficult. The beloved wife and mother of the family, Isla Jodie, has become bedridden with an ever worsening condition affecting her body and mind, leaving her memory and personality lapsing without access to the medication. All Jamie and Alfie can do is watch. It wears on all of them, leading each to cope in their own way. The first half of the movie largely depicts Spike and Jamie on the hunt, with their bows and arrow ready to take out infected. We see different strains of infected in 28 years later, now with 30 years of time to evolve. Slow moving, crawling, infected, regular running, infected, and most terrifying, the roided up alphas. All of these are scary, and Ball keeps up to the quick cutting flashy wedge values to keep the audience's honor. We also get a sense of the rituals and hierarchy that has sprung up within the infected. Again, this is not unique for the genre, but was here interesting. While on their walk about, Spike spots a fire in the distance, which Jamie refuses to talk about. Spike learns later that this belonged to Dr. Carlson Roth, a physician from the old days. Jamie maintains Carlson has lost his mind and become terrifyingly hometical, but Spike, hoping to save his mother, gathers supplies and his mom and heads back to the mainland to try to find his mysterious doctor. 28 years later is very much a film of two halves, while the first half as the last of the us meets. The road vibed to it, found myself much more connected to the second half. Spike and Isla's journey is as sad as a scary. With an apocalypse now when running through it, we also get metaphysical threats on everything, from death and aging to birth and renewal. It's easy to see Garland, modest and partisan for inward exploration on display in the script while always staying true to the reality. Now the world he and Boyles established in 2002. The movie does not enter ground of its own. When a movie veers closer to the zombie movie tropes we have seen for the past decade, it's far less effective. The gore is extreme and escapes blindfold. But I much prefer the more contemplative and somber second part. It takes her time to deal with the death with more maturity than we would expect. I am personally glad this movie chooses to go that direction. The family drama works so well with such solid performances that it goes beyond a survival horror story and into something oddly universal. Comer, Fiona, and especially Williams, really driven, and I wanted even more of them talking. Yes, people to get their heads turned off, and yes, the setup for the next film. That's feel completely out of left. But when 28 years later work, and it does for me more than it does not, I think it's something close to the beautiful. 28 years later is a schedule of Friday, June 20. If all zombies movies are implicitly about the dilemma of living with death, few have ever arrived at a more practical, elegant, or charmingly familiar solution than Dennis, which reveals that the British mainland has been quarantined in order to contain the rage virus that has turned most of the island population into fleet-footed monsters. How convenient it must have been for the rest of the world that all on earth could be so neatly digital undone by the end of the John Carlos but reconnected back into the plus with the opening next of the new sequel that Boyle has been urging to make ever since. Is emblematic of a Sugazi part post 9 by 11 masterpieces that continues to linger in the public imagination because of how nakedly it speaks the savagery that undergirds our civilization, not just the anger that Western society foments against itself, but also the fragility of a species whose personal instinct for self preservation has always been the greatest threat to its collective survival. Our loved one lives forever in our thoughts and prayer, while the faceless herds being slaughtered in some other country might as well have lived at all. As a certain mass murders is thought to have said, one that is a tragedy of million is the static. Zombies movies are scary because they render it intimate, so important that we have to admit there is no differences between them. And 28 days later is perhaps the scariest of them all because it's zombies who come to infection almost as fast as they run, make it all but impossible to escape that fact. The genius of Buzz strange but satisfying 28 years later is that it's spring toward that same idea in search of salvation. Will the unexpected from a film that's been promised for so long, even of its aesthetic bent and penchant for huge narrative swings, are the classic hallmark of a collaboration between Boyle and the screenwriter Alex Garland. This tense and the tender post-apocalyptic drama contents that to exist in the denial of death is to corrupt that integrity of the itself. More fraud than the frightening 28 years later is full of all the jolts and gore you would expect from a big studio horror movie. But the world has changed a lot in the decades since the rage virus spread across England too much for the sequel to get away with replicating the same to dread of its source material. That error of which was unacceptable for the immediacy of this crisis. Rabbit people still race at the screen as if they are going to chew a hole right through it, and the film's prologue is which a room full of children are feasted upon as they watch telebubes, are sick enough to stand alongside the quickest moments from the original, and yet while is smart and our creatively restless enough to recognize that the fast zombies don't have the same kick they did back in 2022, and the rest of the opening sequence is short with the pin there. Due that complacency of a movie that's eager to move on to other calmer thing, namely the isolationist community that forms on Holy Island in the aftermath of the outbreak. They have been there for almost 30 years by the time we lay eyes on the Northumberland real life population 180. The scene of danger is as oppressive as its depressive atmosphere, making the film feel like a true post-apocalyptic movie. Everything is out to get you. The thriller might have deceived some people as there is very little action, and the ending, while intriguing, definitely feels like a bad case of the sequel batting. 28 years later is lean and mean, so there are so space to go to the loo you want to. This is one of the best zombie film in who know how many years, and a great film overall than if it tells only one third of the story. More than 2 years ago, Danny Boyle, she says you are watching a Sun Black movie. It's Christmas. There is a meta voiceover, and some of the best lines are dispensed by a designer. Suited henchman, pleasingly elementary, takes every box. Just as Joss Whedon popped up Avengers, assembles with his unique brand of curiosity. Here, despite the sci-fi, trimmings, and goal budget, it feels like Black's been given carte balance by Marvel to do his thing. The result is a swinging capper with it, bars, heart, and exploding bubbles. Its case bang with a lot of extra. If all zombie movies are implicitly about the dilemma of living with a dead, few have ever arrived, which means that our British mainland has been quarantined in order to contain the wreck. Virus state has turned most of the island population into fleet-footed monsters. How convenient it must have been for the rest of the world that hell on earth could be so neat that it will undone by the end of the John Careless 28 weeks later, in 2007, but reconnected back into Pilates with the opening next of the new sequel that Pearl has been editing to make our sense. Is emblematic of Scorsese post 9 by 11 masterpieces. Based on the Rotten Tomatoes critics and the audience's score for 28 years later, it could end up being one of the most divisive movies of the year. Currently, the zombie apocalypse horror movie has a critics score of 89% and an audience's score of 65%, while Rotten Tomatoes overall reviews for 28 years later have been quite positive. There are undoubtedly a lot of depths heading into the film, especially since 28 years later broke a franchise record with its critics score. However, it's clear that the movie is not resonated with all audiences. Not only does the movie serve as the third film in a franchise that also include 2002 28 days later and 2027 28 weeks later, but it is also the start of the brand new trilogy. In fact, the upcoming 28 years later, The Bone Temple has already been filmed and will continue the stories of characters like Spike Jamie, Dr. Carlson, and the mysterious Jimmy. There is still a lot of hype of a sequel, but let's take a look at why 28 years later has divided critics and audiences so much. Since 28 Days Later is one of the most acclaimed zombie movies of all time, it honestly would have been quite easy for the long-awaited third film in the franchise to satisfy general audiences. Ever since the release of the first movie, fans have wanted characters like Cillian Murphy Jim and Naomi Harris. Therefore, director Danny Boyle and writer Alex Garland could have easily gone the traditional legacy sequel route with 28 years later. Instead, they chose to tell a completely original story which featured brand new characters. Entertainment Weekly Jordan Hoffman noted his review of the film. Instead of playing it safe, Violent Garland made sure that 28 years later is strange, predictable, gloriously revolting, darkly funny, and when you least expect it. Rather touching by making bold creative decisions such as shooting on an iPhone and primarily following a young boy. Boyle and Garland successfully created a true unique blockbusters. However, decisions like this are bound to be somewhat divisive. Some of the behind the scene decisions that were made during the production or 28 years later may not be received well by certain people. However, without a doubt, the most divisive part of the film is its ending. At the end of 28 years later, Spike meets Jack's colonel, Jimmy, and group of survivors. The members of Jimmy's group act like they are Power Rangers and do some flips and impressively acrobatic as they kill a group of infected to protect Spike. O'Connor's characters and his group, who are inspired by UK media personality and consummate sequel predator Jimmy Savile, while the important character in the Bone Temple. These action sequences feel so different from the rest of the movie, which is the grisly why name viewers have argued that it runs what would otherwise be a great film. Clearly, O'Connor's character and his group, who are inspired by the British media personality and the condemned sequel Predator, Jimmy Savile, will be important characters in the Bone Temple. However, since their introduction feels so random in 28 years later, the ending has not sat right with a lot of viewers. Even the ending has not been that effective for certain viewers. Most critics and audiences agree that the infected are terrifying in 28 years later, since it has been many years since the initial rage virus outbreak in the United Kingdom and infected have evolved. In the new movie, the characters have to encounter alphas while traveling on the mainland. Alphas are much smarter and stronger than the others infected and even give them order. One scene is particular, which featured in Alpha's chasing Spike and Jamie across the causeway, which led to other community, may end up being one of the most memorable and scary movie sequences for the year. However, aside from the Alpha, as CBR's Cathy Doll point out, it's the infected human appearance that are the source of some of the horror. Throughout the movie, characters like Spike and Dr. Coulson try to avoid killing the infected since they were once human as well, which is one interesting commentary on the genre and arguably adds more horror to the film. The aforementioned causeway, chase scenes, and some other action sequences featuring Spike and his fathers are great, but some viewers have argued that the second half of 28 years later is boring. Burns' most recent film is kind of divided into the two parts. The first part follows Spike and his father and features plenty of thrilling sequences, but the second half of the film sees a young boy traveling on the mainland with his mother. Isla once Spike and his mother make it to Dr. Carson. The movie slows down quite a bit. In writer David in thriller describes Spike and his last encounter with Dr. Carson as mediative and downbeat. While early means this is a positive, it is clear that a lot of viewers got bored during Dr. Carson's speech about the meaning of life and death. Since it is the technically summer blockbuster, some people may have expected more consistent action in 28 years later. Even some people may not have liked the pacing of the film. It can't be denied that all the characters and action 28 years later are great, while most of the characters are sidelined for a large chunk for the movie. Spike, who is played by Alfie Williams, is a constant throughout. In the Hollywood Reporter's David Downey's review of the film, he praises Williams and claimed that he plays Spike with a poignant balance of vulnerability and resilience. Even though the ending is controversial, people can't wait to see what happened to Spike next. Williams' performance as Spike may be clearly stand out in 28 years later, but this does not mean the other characters are not amazing too. Aaron Taylor Johnson's Jodie Comer and Ralph Fiennes are incredible in 28 years later. The actors are play were layered characters who represent different kinds of survivor in a world of 28 years days later franchise. Therefore, critics and audiences mostly agree that all the characters are interesting and the actors deliver exceptional performances. Even practically all the performances in 28 years later have been praised by the critics and fans. Many people did not leave the theaters feeling emotional as was the intent. As mentioned, even through all the scene between Spike Isla and Dr. Carlson are surprisingly reflective and touching. The slow pace of the second half of 28 years later has not been received well by everyone. Therefore, not only were some viewers bored during the second half of the movie, but the emotional climax of the film did not land for certain people. As explained by Collater's Emma Kelly in her review of the movie, Dr. Coulson teaches Spike that life and death are not the penance of good and evil. Additionally, Kelly argues that it's fair theatrical music on morality that make 28 years later such a standout in a statured subgenre. Obviously, the emotion that 28 years later is meant to bring about it being incredibly effective for critics. However, artists and reviewers are much more critical of Dr. Carson's lessons, and many people simply wanted an action-packed zombie movie. Another possible reason why 28 years later audiences score is so much lower than the critics' score is that Murphy does not reprise his role as Jim in the film. Now it should be noted that it was confirmed months ago that Morphe would not appear in the first movie in the trilogy. In fact, Boyle has actually stated that Morphe will return at the end of 28 years later, the Bone Temple. However, it's very likely that general audiences did not know about this when the bought tickets for the trilogy's first movie. Therefore, it's possible that some Rotten Tomatoes user gave 28 years later a low score because they were expecting Morphe to return in the film. Obviously, this is not the fault of Garland or the rest of the film creative team. And the team and edited 28 years later was always intended to be a new, somewhat standalone story. However, it still needs to be noted that it could be a reason why the film has been too divisive on Rotten Tomatoes. Since it has been 28 years later since the Rex virus wiped out most of the UK, a lot of fans wanted to learn more about the state of the rest of the world in 28 years later. The new film does include some world building. For instance, it is established that patrol boats for different countries constantly sail around the UK to make sure nobody escapes the island. Additionally, the Swedish soldier Spike and Isla meet about halfway. So the film makes it clear that the rest of the world they developed like nothing is wrong. However, several fans are annoyed that the franchise's newest movie quickly brushes over the ending of the 28 years later, which saw a group of infected storm Paris. Therefore, it's obvious that many fans expected this rage virus to have more worldwide consequences rather than just be contained to the UK. The infected only existing in the UK is another reason why the 28 years later franchise is so unique, but not all fans like this idea. Therefore, some people wish 28 years later was not kept entirely in the UK, which could explain some negative reviews. Sources Entertainment. Here there are again Danny Boyle and Alex Garland zombies. True, unlike the usual some big slow movers. Of course, these things can spring not time course in stereo. Back in 2002, screenwriter Garland and director Boyle had a monster hit with their most apocalyptic horror thriller 28 years later about a rage virus that leaks off a lab and turning people into the aggressive zombie causes a complete lab and utter breakdown in 28 days later. Bell famously made smart use of dumb, new lightweight digital tech which let him bring out the miracle of unlicensed gorilla shooting at dawn in the deserted London street. That was for Fierce musical film making too. I have never been a fan of zombies whose mass presence done us now requires silly gurning catch up extras who can't be clearly looked at for any length of time without a getting laugh. For my money, it was only Asia Red Zombies horror comedy Shaun of the Dead, which came out 2 years afterward, which fully explored the real intimate horror of the zombieism, the gap between the being the beaten and the transforming. In 2007, a lackluster sequel 28 weeks later brought a franchise stumbling into a bud. Now we have 28 years later an interesting, tonally uncertain development which takes a generational, even evolutionary leap into the future from the initial catalogs for creating something that mixes folk horror, little England stare, and even a grieving process for all that has happened. And then are some closer cameo appearances. We are now on Holy Island of England's northeast coast, where is a barricaded, self-governing community grows its own food, breeds its own beer, and stays apart from the British mainland, which is a lawless, quarantined hellhole where zombies roam free, prosecuting and living off the vast herd of uncured deer. There is a starting unintended moment of sadness. Incidentally, we get a glimpse of the Skymore Gap, 3 years Harridan Wall, evi- evidently filmed before it was cut down. The Holy Island manfolk make forging expenditures across the water via the causeway at low tide, killing zombies with bows and arrows to burnish their bunter greater instinct. Some of these zombies are alpha runner, but others are slow movers, natural for target practice, bulbous clutches crawling on their stomachs. Spike Williams is a 12 years old kid whose adult Noma Isla is unwell, confused, and depressed. His dad, Jamie, takes Spike on a tour to the mainland, a rite of the passage which brings him to the manhood. But then Spike becomes obsessed with rumors of a doctor still living in this danger zone, who carries out bizarre rituals like a cross between the Marlon Brando and Dennis Hopper in the Apocalypse Now. Spike disobeys all the island rule by taking his numb with him into a forbidden area on a desperate quest to find this doctor who can cure him. Holy Island is certainly a fascinating place, ripe of scary filmmaking as Roman showed with his 1966 movie Garland and the ball give us some intriguing hint as to how the community that regressed into a kind of fortress mentality, living like a stone age version of the 50s. Archive clips of the archers of the agony court in Olivier's Henry, we show the subconscious groupthink relies on the ancient warrior craft and a profound mistrust of the French. But a little awkwardly, the film has to get onto mainland for some badass action sequences with real shooting weaponry. And then we have the two alpha cameos that it would be the unsporting to reveal, but which cause the film to shine between deep sadness and a bizarre, unperceivable though certainly starting graphic novel strangeness, dare to promote franchise's continuation. So the zombies carry on their dual speed, intergoing but pointing on the circle. 28 years later is out on 19 June in Australia and 20 June in the US and UK. Tiny and screenwriter Alex Garland floated Britain with a rich virus that evolved undead from a shifting. The timing of the film's sequel, 28 years later, now in Australian cinema, feels apt. Zombie films have found major commercial success in recent decades, but creatively they have stalled. The first zombies had gritty narrative of Boyle's original film have been endlessly recycled. Is telling that the most popular example of this genre, HBO The Last of Us, is an adaptation of a 2013 video game. If the apocalypse was a fun article to consider in the early 2010s, the peak of the zombie saturation, the pandemic has made social collapse a more immediate. Now 68 years old, has lost little of the apocalyptic fury that charged his pioneering classic. 28 years later begins on a scalded island whose inhabitants have successfully weathered the few decades since the rage virus broke contentment. The fortified community is connected to the mainland Britain via low-lying coastal path, where villagers go to gather resources and, in the case of 12 years old Spike Alpha, score a first infective kill. As part of his coming of age rite, Spiker father Jamie Johnson accompanies him for his first encounter with undead. Their mission quickly goes sideways when they encounter an alpha, a mutated variant with a colossal strength and a pack of underlings under command. The mainland is also revealed to be home to Brilliant Galson, a doctor branded as a madman by the villager for his unconventional handling of the handed it, potentially the only hope for Spiker's mother, Isla, whose mind and body have been wrecked by a mysterious disease. The first stretch of the film is an effectively nervy exercise in folk horror, but it's not immediately clear why. After so many years, Boyle and Garland decided to revise this world. Save for the some flashes for clever world building, the village being comprised of die-hard Queen Lee's cruelties is obliquely hilarious. The expanded scope of 28 years later initially stays confident to the well-trodden General territory. Cultish enclaves are uppers represented presently post-apocalypse, while the virus alpha mutation is a glitch better suited to the video game. One of the early surprises is that, with the scarcity of human flesh, some of the surprising zombies of yore have been reduced to a crawl. The transition from mini Davis hypothetically hazy texture to iPhone cinematography makes for an intriguing stylistic difference, if not a revolutionary one. Is the hands of returning OJP Anthony Dodd Mantle. Digital versions of the Dogme 95, the iPhone 15 Max 4 touch lens on airy and relative to the film, visible in city focus, wide angles and sharp edges, the horizon hanging oppressively across the overgrown landscape. Unlike a typical phone recording, the image is stretched into a panoramic aspect ratio usually reserved for the Hollywood aspects, while the colors are intensified into a iridescent hues. It's an astonishing advertisement for what consumer electronics are capable of nowadays. Thoda film resists some of the more idealistic limitations of pocket camera. There is a noticeable shift away from a scrappy, low-budget organizer body's occasional use of the drones and expensive cinema cameras adding an additional sheen to its exterior. The particular aspects narrative are better left to be discovered, especially as the film saves most tantalistic ideas for its full stretch. An imminent follow-up directed by Canadian's Naya Da Costa is set for release in just 7 months, leaving this legacy sequel feeling a little incomplete. The human story 28 years later is surprisingly compelling in its own right and, unlike the broader expansion of this world, it keeps satisfying content. Fans usually command the third act of the film with a unique take on a Dr. Coulson's and Jim Curtis' life figure